You are not supposed to be here. Victoria Hale did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The words landed flat and precise, like something already decided before he stepped off the service elevator. The hallway held its breath. Caleb Turner paused mid-step, one hand still on the metal handle of his toolbox. Not a full stop, just enough for the weight of the sentence to register. He shifted his grip, fingers tightening once before loosening again, then let the box settle against his thigh. A faint hum from the recessed lighting filled the silence that followed. Two assistants near the glass wall lowered their voices without meaning to, eyes flicking up and then away. Caleb lifted his gaze, not to her face at first, but past her shoulder, where a thin red indicator blinked steadily on a control panel embedded in the wall. He blinked once, slow, like he was adjusting to the brightness of the space rather than the tone of her voice. Then he looked at her. Victoria stood 10 feet away, tablet angled slightly toward her chest, one hand resting along its edge as if anchoring the moment in place. Her posture did not shift. She did not repeat herself. She did not need to. The distance between them stayed exactly what it was supposed to be. A man in a tailored suit near the conference room door cleared his throat, not loudly, just enough to signal alignment with the room's center of gravity. Caleb's shoulders rose a fraction on an inhale, then settled. He adjusted his stance, sliding 1 foot half an inch back to square himself with the wall instead of her. Not retreating, just not advancing. Maintenance, he said, quiet, even, as if answering a question she had not asked. He did not lift the toolbox, did not step closer. The word hung there, small against the polished glass and steel. Victoria's eyes moved once, quick and clinical, from his face to the name patch on his shirt, then back again. The pause stretched just long enough for someone at the far end of the hall to stop walking. A security badge clipped to Caleb's belt tapped lightly against the metal of his toolbox as he shifted his weight, the sound soft but distinct in the controlled quiet. He followed it, with his eyes for a brief second, then lifted them again, returning to the panel behind her. The red light blinked. On. Off. On. Victoria turned her head a few degrees, not enough to fully acknowledge the panel, just enough to register that he was looking past her. Her chin lifted slightly. This floor is restricted during active meetings, she said, tone unchanged, each word placed with care, like she was aligning furniture in a room she owned. No one interrupted. No one corrected her. Caleb nodded once. Not agreement. Not apology. Just recognition of the rule as it existed. His thumb traced a faint line along the edge of the toolbox latch, then stilled. He did not move toward the elevator. He did not move toward her. The red light blinked again, steady, patient, waiting for someone to decide what mattered more, the rule or the reason it was there. Caleb kept his place. Not closer. Not gone. Caleb let the nod settle where it was, then shifted his weight just enough to take the pressure off his back foot. The hallway lights reflected along the brushed metal of his toolbox, a thin line of white that moved as he adjusted his grip. He angled the box slightly, setting it down beside his shoe instead of holding it between them. The motion was quiet, deliberate, like placing something that did not belong in the middle of a room but needed to exist there anyway. No one told him to pick it back up. A soft chime from the conference room behind Victoria signaled a meeting reminder, but no one moved to open the door. The assistants kept their positions, one of them scrolling on a tablet without really reading. Caleb's gaze returned to the panel. The red light blinked again, steady, indifferent. He followed the pattern once, then looked lower, tracing the seam of the casing where it met the wall. His hand hovered near the latch on his toolbox, not opening it, just resting there as if measuring the distance. His breathing evened out, shoulders settling into a stillness that did not ask permission. Victoria did not step aside. She remained where she was, the space around her holding its shape. A faint click echoed from somewhere above the ceiling tiles, subtle but out of rhythm with the rest of the floor. Caleb's eyes lifted toward the sound for a second, then dropped back to neutral. He slid his foot an inch to the side, aligning himself parallel to the wall, leaving the center of the hallway untouched. He did not leave. He did not advance. The red light kept blinking. The service elevator doors closed with a soft, padded thud, sealing off the polished quiet of the executive floor like it had never opened. Caleb stood alone in the narrow space, the faint vibration of descent traveling up through his boots. He shifted the toolbox from his right hand to his left, rolling his shoulder once to ease the tension that had settled there without asking. The metal handle left a shallow imprint across his palm, a thin line that faded as he flexed his fingers. He watched the floor numbers tick down in small red digits, each one steady, predictable. When the doors opened on the lower level, the air felt different. Cooler, less filtered. The hum of machinery replaced the muted silence upstairs, a low, constant presence that did not mind who stood in it. He stepped out, boots landing on concrete instead of polished stone, and the sound carried just a little farther. A cart rattled somewhere down the corridor. Someone laughed, short and unguarded, then went back to work. Caleb walked past a row of storage cages, keys clipped to his belt brushing lightly against the metal as he moved. He paused at a workbench long enough to set the toolbox down, unclipping the latch with a soft click. Inside, everything sat where it should. Wrenches aligned. Screwdrivers grouped by size. A coil of spare wire tucked into the corner. He ran a thumb along the edge of a small adjustable wrench, then closed the box again without taking anything out. The motion was automatic, practiced, like checking a door even when you knew it was locked. Outside, the late afternoon light had started to flatten, stretching long across the parking lot. Caleb's truck sat near the far end, a faded blue pickup with a dent along the rear panel that caught the light at a certain angle. He unlocked it with a quiet beep, set the toolbox onto the passenger seat, and took a moment before climbing in. His hand rested on the steering wheel, fingers tapping once, then stilling. The red blink from the panel upstairs stayed with him longer than the ride down should have allowed, not as a thought, but as a rhythm that had not fully left his body. He turned the key. The engine came alive with a low rumble that filled the cab. On the drive home, traffic moved slow through a stretch of construction, orange cones narrowing the lanes. Caleb kept a steady pace, one hand at the top of the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift. A car behind him honked once, impatient, then fell back when there was nowhere to go. He did not speed up. At a red light, he glanced at the passenger seat, at the toolbox sitting where it always did, then back to the road as the light turned green. By the time he pulled into his neighborhood, the sky had softened into a pale blue, fading toward gray. Small houses lined the street, porches lit early, a basketball bouncing somewhere out of sight. Caleb parked along the curb in front of his place, cut the engine, and sat for a second in the quiet that followed. The ticking of the cooling engine filled the space where the city noise had been. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of laundry detergent and something sweet left cooling on the stove. A pair of small sneakers sat by the door, one tipped slightly onto its side. Caleb nudged it upright with the toe of his boot before stepping in fully. "Daddy," a voice called from the other room, light, certain. "In here," he answered, setting the toolbox down near the wall, just inside the line where the floor changed from tile to worn carpet. His daughter, Lila, sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper spread in front of her, colored pencils scattered in a loose arc. She looked up, pushing a curl away from her face with the back of her hand, leaving a faint streak of blue near her cheek. Caleb noticed it, paused, then reached over to wipe it gently with his thumb. She leaned into the touch without thinking, then went back to her drawing. He moved to the sink, turned on the water, and washed his hands slowly, watching the thin line of dust and grease slip away under the stream. The rhythm of it settled him. He dried them on a towel draped over the oven handle, smoothing the fabric back into place before turning toward the stove. A pot sat there, lid slightly askew, steam escaping in soft bursts. He adjusted it, lowering the heat by a small turn of the dial. Behind him, Lila shifted in her chair, the legs scraping lightly against the floor. "Can you look at this?" she asked, holding up the paper without turning around. Caleb stepped closer, leaning just enough to see. It was a drawing of a building, tall, with rows of windows and a small red square near the top. "That is the control room," she said, tapping the square with her pencil. Caleb's eyes stayed on it for a moment longer than needed. The red mark was uneven, pressed harder than the rest of the lines. He nodded once. "Looks important," he said quietly. Lila smiled, satisfied, and turned back to add another line. Caleb straightened, reaching for 2 plates from the cabinet. As he set them on the table, his movements slowed just slightly, a fraction of a beat off the usual rhythm, before settling back into place. The room filled with the soft sounds of evening, Pencils against paper, the low simmer from the stove, the quiet presence of two people moving through familiar motions. Outside, a car passed, headlights sliding briefly across the wall before disappearing. Caleb glanced toward the window, then back to the table, his hand resting for a second on the back of Lila's chair before he pulled it out and sat down across from her. The next morning carried a thinner kind of light, cooler, more direct. Caleb stepped off the service elevator onto the same floor, his boots landing softer this time, as if the space required it. The hallway was already active, but quieter than the levels below. Conversation stayed low, contained within glass walls. Shoes moved with purpose, but without sound. He adjusted the strap of his tool belt across his shoulder, settling the weight so it would not shift as he walked. The red indicator on the wall was no longer blinking. The panel sat still, sealed, its surface reflecting the clean lines of the corridor. Caleb slowed a fraction as he passed it, not stopping, just letting his eyes move across the seam he had traced the day before. No one acknowledged it. No one acknowledged him. A man in a navy suit stepped out of a conference room, pausing just long enough to let Caleb pass first, though his body angled away as if to avoid brushing shoulders. Caleb gave a slight nod without breaking stride. Near the end of the hall, a cart had been left half against the wall, its wheels not fully locked. One side leaned into the path, narrowing the walkway by a few inches. Caleb reached out and nudged it back into place with the side of his hand, aligning it flush against the baseboard. The movement was quick, almost invisible, but it straightened the line of the hallway. He continued on. Through the glass to his right, Victoria stood at the head of a long table, her back partially turned, one hand resting on the surface while the other traced something on a screen. She did not look up. The people around her did not look away from her. Caleb's reflection passed across the glass for a second, then disappeared as he moved beyond the room. At the junction near the corner, he paused just long enough to check a ceiling vent, tilting his head slightly, as if listening for a difference in airflow. The sound was steady. He reached up, adjusted the edge of the grill by less than an inch, then lowered his hand. Behind him, footsteps approached, then slowed. Someone waited for him to move. Caleb stepped aside without turning, creating space without signaling it. The person passed, murmuring a quiet thank you that did not quite reach his ears. He resumed walking, keeping close to the wall, leaving the center clear. The hallway seemed to widen and narrow around him, depending on who entered it. At the far end, near the windows, the light shifted again, brighter, cutting across the floor in long rectangles. Caleb stepped through one, the brightness catching the edge of his sleeve, then moved back into shadow. He adjusted the position of his toolbox in his hand, lifting it slightly to avoid the glare reflecting into his eyes. From the conference room, a door opened. Voices spilled out briefly, then quieted as people filtered into the hall. Victoria stepped out last. She did not rush. She did not look around. Her presence settled into the space the way it had the day before, without needing to announce itself. As she moved forward, the flow of people adjusted around her, subtle shifts in direction, small pauses that created a path. Caleb noticed it without turning his head. He shifted half a step closer to the wall, giving the corridor its full width. His shoulder brushed lightly against the cool surface behind him, grounding his position. Victoria passed within a few feet, her gaze forward, pace unchanged. For a moment, the hallway held both of them in the same frame, moving in parallel lines that did not intersect. Caleb's eyes dropped briefly to the floor, tracking the line of the baseboard, then lifted again to the far end of the corridor where another panel waited, quiet, closed, unremarkable. He continued toward it, his steps even, measured, as the sounds of the floor resumed their controlled rhythm behind him. The panel at the far end of the corridor sat slightly ajar, not enough to draw attention unless someone was already looking for it. Caleb slowed as he approached, his steps easing into a quieter rhythm, the rubber soles of his boots barely registering against the floor. A faint draft slipped through the narrow gap, just enough to shift the edge of a loose paper taped to the wall beside it. He reached out, not to the panel yet, but to the paper, pressing it flat with 2 fingers before letting his hand fall back to his side. The hallway behind him did not empty, but it did not move the same way either. People passed, though more carefully now, their pace adjusting in small increments as they neared his position. Caleb set his toolbox down beside the wall, aligning it parallel to the baseboard, leaving the center of the corridor untouched. He crouched, resting one knee lightly against the floor, and opened the latch with a controlled click. The sound carried just enough to mark the moment without breaking the quiet. Inside, the tools remained in their precise order. He selected a small flashlight, turning it on briefly, the beam cutting a narrow line into the gap of the panel before he switched it off again. He did not reach inside. Not yet. Footsteps approached from behind, then slowed. A pair of polished shoes stopped a few feet away, angled toward him but not crossing into his space. Caleb remained where he was, one hand resting on the edge of the open toolbox, the other hovering near the panel seam as if measuring something invisible. He exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, then shifted his weight slightly to ease the pressure on his knee. The door to the conference room down the hall opened again, voices spilling out in a brief wave before settling back into quiet. This time, they did not disperse as quickly. A few lingered, their attention drifting, not directly fixed on him, but not leaving either. Caleb's fingers traced along the bottom edge of the panel, stopping where the alignment broke by less than a quarter inch. He pressed gently, feeling the resistance, then let it go. He reached into his toolbox and picked up a thin flathead screwdriver, turning it once in his hand before placing it back exactly where it had been. The motion was small, almost unnecessary, but it reset something in his posture. Behind him, the flow of movement slowed again. Someone shifted their stance. A quiet murmur started, then stopped before forming words. Caleb lifted his head slightly, not turning, just enough to catch the reflection in the glass panel across the hall. Victoria stood there now, closer than before, her figure steady in the reflection, though the glass softened its edges. She was not speaking, not moving. Her presence held the space in a way that did not require direction. Caleb looked at the reflection for a second longer than he needed, then lowered his gaze back to the panel. He closed the toolbox halfway, not fully securing it, and rose to his feet in one smooth motion. The hallway seemed to pause with him, the small movements around him settling into stillness for a brief moment. He adjusted the position of the toolbox at his side, lifting it an inch to clear the floor, then set it down again. The panel remained slightly open. The draft continued, faint but steady. Caleb placed his hand flat against the wall beside it, feeling the subtle vibration beneath the surface. His fingers spread, then stilled. He could have reached in, could have corrected it quickly, quietly, without drawing more attention. Instead, he stepped back half a pace, creating space between himself and the panel, his shoulder aligning once more with the wall. The screwdriver remained inside the box. The latch stayed loose. Behind him, the presence in the reflection did not shift. No instruction came. No permission either. The air in the corridor felt thinner now, as if every movement carried a little more weight than before. Caleb adjusted his stance again, feet settling into a balanced position, neither moving forward nor away. His gaze lifted once more to the seam of the panel, then to the floor just beyond it, mapping the line of the corridor as it stretched ahead. The red indicator was gone. The system was quiet, but the attention remained, gathered in the small space around him, waiting without asking. Caleb did not fill it. He let the moment hold, his hands still, his posture steady, the toolbox at his side unopened, as the hallway continued to watch without speaking. Caleb let the moment sit where it was, the open panel breathing a faint line of cool air into the corridor. The screwdriver stayed inside the box. His hand rested once more against the wall, then dropped. Somewhere down the hall, a heel tapped twice against the floor, then stopped, as if the person wearing it had remembered where they were. The reflection in the glass remained. Victoria had not moved. Caleb shifted his weight back onto both feet, steadying, then bent slightly at the waist and reached past the edge of the panel, not into it, but lower, toward the narrow return vent set into the baseboard just beneath. It was the kind of vent most people never noticed, a thin grill no more than 8 inches long, painted to disappear into the wall. A faint whistling slipped through it now, uneven, catching at the edges. Caleb's fingers hovered there for a brief second, a pause that carried intention without announcement. He glanced once at the seam of the main panel above, then back down to the vent. No one spoke. He slid 2 fingers into the small notch at the side of the grill and eased it open with a careful pull. The metal gave with a soft, dry click. Inside, a strip of filter material had folded in on itself, pinched along one corner where it had not been seated properly. The airflow pushed against it, creating the uneven pull that had been building quietly through the system. Caleb did not look back. He reached into his pocket and drew out a folded shop cloth, the same one he used to wipe his hands, and wrapped it once around his fingers before touching the filter. The motion was slow, controlled, so it would not tear. He eased the corner free, smoothing the material back into place, pressing along the edge until it sat flush against the frame. The whistling softened immediately, then disappeared into the broader hum of the building. He held it there for a second longer, making sure it would not shift again, then closed the grill with the same care, aligning it until the edges met clean. The sound it made this time was softer, almost absorbed by the hallway. Caleb straightened, unfolding the cloth and tucking it back into his pocket. The panel above remained slightly open, unchanged, the larger system untouched. He stepped back into his previous position, neither closer to the panel nor farther from it, restoring the line he had held before. Around him, the hallway adjusted in a way that was not quite visible. A man near the conference room shifted his stance, the angle of his shoulders easing. Someone further down resumed walking, the rhythm of their steps returning in measured intervals. The air itself felt more even, less strained, though nothing had been announced. Nothing had been declared fixed. Caleb reached down and closed the latch of his toolbox, this time securing it fully with a firm, quiet click. He did not pick it up right away. His hand rested on the handle for a moment, then released. In the glass, Victoria's reflection held a fraction longer than before. Not closer, not softer, but more precise, as if the distance between observation and conclusion had narrowed by an inch. Caleb did not look toward her again. He kept his focus forward, on the corridor that extended beyond the panel, beyond the point where the light shifted near the windows. After a brief pause, he lifted the toolbox, adjusting his grip so it sat balanced against his leg, and took a step forward. Not away from the panel, not toward it either, just continuing along the route he had come to complete. The panel remained open behind him, unchanged, still waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. But the small, unseen imbalance beneath it had been corrected, quietly, without request, without announcement. And in the space that followed, the silence settled differently, less like something being held in place, more like something that could move again. Caleb had taken 3 steps past the panel when the change showed itself, not in sound, but in timing. A door farther down the corridor opened a beat earlier than expected, the hydraulic hinge no longer resisting the pressure difference that had been building behind it. The woman holding the handle paused mid-motion, her hand lingering as the door settled cleanly into place instead of pulling back against her. She glanced once at the frame, then continued through without comment. Behind her, the hallway seemed to recalibrate. The air moved evenly now, no subtle push against sleeves or papers, no uneven draft catching at edges. A technician near the junction tapped his tablet, frowned briefly, then tapped again. "That is odd," he murmured under his breath, not loud enough to carry far, but enough to register in the quiet. The line of data he was watching had flattened, the minor fluctuation gone. He looked up, eyes scanning the corridor, then landing for a moment on the panel Caleb had left behind. Caleb did not turn. He kept walking, pace unchanged, the toolbox steady at his side. The rhythm of his steps remained consistent, neither quickened nor slowed by the shift behind him. In the glass, the reflection altered by a fraction. Victoria's posture held, but her head turned slightly now, not toward the panel itself, but toward the lower line of the wall where the vent had been adjusted. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible unless someone was already watching her. Her gaze stayed there a second longer than it had before, measuring something that had not been part of the equation a moment ago. The people near the conference room resumed their motion, but not fully. Their steps carried a hesitation, a brief delay as attention redistributed. One assistant glanced toward Caleb, then away, then back again, as if confirming a detail she had not expected to matter. The technician moved closer to the panel, crouching slightly to inspect it without opening it. He ran his hand along the seam, then down toward the baseboard, fingers brushing the vent grill. He paused there, feeling the steady pull of air, then straightened. "Flow is balanced," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. The words did not travel far, but they did not need to. Victoria stepped forward, closing part of the distance she had kept before. Not all of it. Just enough that the space between her and the panel shifted from observation to proximity. She did not touch it. She did not give an instruction. Her eyes moved from the panel to the floor, then along the wall, tracing the line Caleb had followed moments earlier. For a brief second, her reflection aligned with his path instead of standing apart from it. Caleb reached the next section of the corridor where another access point sat flush against the wall. He set his toolbox down, opened it with the same controlled motion, and selected a different tool this time, a small hex key. His hands moved with the same precision, the same economy, as if the attention behind him had not changed at all. He did not look back. He did not adjust his pace to acknowledge the shift. Behind him, Victoria stopped. The movement was subtle, but it broke the forward flow she had maintained throughout the morning. One of the executives walking beside her took a step ahead before realizing she had not followed, then paused, turning slightly as if waiting for direction. She did not speak. Her gaze remained on the wall, then shifted once more toward Caleb's position, not directly, but enough to include him in the frame of what she was now seeing. The corridor held that moment differently. Not frozen, not tense in the same way as before, but recalibrated, as if a small piece of it had been adjusted and everything else was quietly accounting for it. Caleb tightened the hex key with a measured turn, then another, listening to the faint change in pitch as the metal settled into place. He stopped at the right point, not forcing it further, and returned the tool to its slot. He closed the toolbox, lifted it, and continued forward. The panel behind him remained slightly open, unchanged, still waiting. But the reason it had held attention before no longer sat where it had. And in that shift, the control of the space no longer rested entirely in the same place it had at the start of the day. Caleb moved past the second access point without breaking rhythm, the toolbox steady against his leg as he continued down the corridor. Behind him, the small cluster near the first panel no longer held its shape the same way. The technician stepped back from the wall, no longer crouched, his tablet angled differently now as he walked, attention returning to the screen instead of the space around it. The assistants resumed their quiet exchanges, voices low but no longer suspended. The hallway regained a natural flow, not rushed, just unforced. Victoria remained where she had paused, but the stillness around her shifted. She looked once more at the base of the wall, then at the panel above it, her gaze moving between the two as if recalibrating where the problem had actually been. Her hand, still holding the tablet, lowered slightly from its previous position, no longer held at chest height like a barrier, but resting closer to her side. An executive beside her began to speak, a question forming, but stopped midway when she did not immediately respond. That half-second delay altered the cadence of the exchange. Victoria did not answer right away. She took a small step forward instead, not toward the center of the corridor, but along the wall Caleb had followed, her path aligning with his earlier movement. It was not a direct acknowledgement, but it shifted the line of attention. A few feet ahead, Caleb reached a maintenance hatch near the floor, smaller than the others, secured with 2 visible screws. He set the toolbox down again, this time closer to his right foot, and knelt with one knee hovering just above the ground before settling lightly. He selected a compact driver, adjusting the bit with a quiet click before applying it to the first screw. The motion was precise, measured, unchanged. He did not look back. The sound of the tool turning was soft but consistent, threading through the ambient noise of the floor. Behind him, Victoria slowed as she approached the first panel, stopping just short of it. She did not touch it. Instead, she angled her head slightly, as if listening, not to the panel itself, but to the absence of the earlier irregularity. The corridor no longer pushed against itself. The air moved cleanly. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a subtle adjustment that broke the fixed stance she had held before. Her gaze moved once more, this time forward, following the line of the wall toward where Caleb now worked. The distance between them remained, but the orientation had changed. A man passing between them hesitated briefly, then continued without altering his path, no longer needing to adjust around an invisible boundary. The space felt shared now, even if no one named it that way. Caleb removed the second screw and placed it carefully on the edge of the hatch, aligning it parallel to the first. He opened the panel just enough to inspect inside, then paused, listening for a beat, as if confirming something only he could hear. Satisfied, he adjusted a small internal bracket, tightening it with a single controlled turn before closing the hatch again. He replaced the screws, securing them with the same even pressure, then returned the driver to its slot. His movements remained consistent, unaffected by the subtle shift behind him. Victoria watched the sequence without interruption. When Caleb stood, lifting the toolbox again, she did not move out of the way or assert position. Instead, she held where she was, allowing the natural flow of the corridor to pass between them. For a brief moment, their paths aligned in parallel once more, but without the earlier tension pressing against the space. An assistant walked through, glancing between them, then continued on, her pace steady. The attention that had gathered earlier dispersed into smaller, quieter observations, no longer fixed on a single point. Caleb adjusted the position of the toolbox in his hand and continued down the corridor, his steps even, his focus forward. Behind him, Victoria remained near the panel a moment longer, her posture no longer rigid, her gaze no longer fixed in a single direction. Then she turned slightly, not back toward the conference room, but along the corridor, following the line that had been redrawn without words. Caleb reached the end of the corridor where the service elevator waited, its stainless steel doors reflecting a softened version of the floor behind him. He set his toolbox down briefly, pressing the call button with the back of his knuckle, then picked it up again before the light above the panel finished blinking. The hallway behind him continued without interruption now. Conversations resumed at their natural pace. A chair rolled across polished concrete inside a conference room, the sound no longer muffled by tension. Someone laughed, quiet but unrestrained. The space had returned to itself, but not exactly the same. Near the panel he had passed earlier, Victoria stood for a moment longer, her attention no longer fixed on a single point. A technician approached with a tablet in hand, pausing just short of her, waiting. She glanced once at the panel, then down along the baseboard where the vent sat flush and unremarkable. Her fingers shifted slightly against the edge of her tablet, then stilled. When the technician began to speak, she raised her hand a fraction, not to stop him entirely, but enough to hold the moment. She took a small step to the side, clearing the direct line to the panel, her body no longer occupying the center of the space. It was a simple adjustment, almost incidental, but it changed the access. The technician moved forward without hesitation, kneeling to inspect the panel with both hands free. Victoria did not follow. She remained just off to the side, her posture relaxed by a degree, her stance no longer forming a barrier. Down the hall, Caleb did not look back. The elevator doors opened with a soft glide. He stepped inside, turning once to set the toolbox down near his feet, aligning it with the corner of the cab. As the doors began to close, the corridor narrowed into a thin vertical frame. For a brief second, Victoria's figure crossed that line of sight, not centered, not distant, just part of the space as it moved on. She paused near the wall, her gaze lowered slightly, then shifted her weight and continued in the opposite direction. The doors met without sound. The elevator descended, the hum of the building returning to a steady, even tone. Caleb rested his hand lightly on the top of the toolbox, fingers still, his posture unchanged. When the doors opened on the lower level, the air felt open again, less measured, more forgiving. He stepped out, adjusting the strap on his shoulder as he walked toward the exit. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across the lot, catching the edge of his truck in a dull reflection. He set the toolbox inside, closed the door with a quiet push, and stood for a second with his hand resting against the metal. The building behind him rose in clean lines, its glass catching the sky. Nothing about it suggested what had shifted inside. Caleb climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and pulled away at an even pace, the tires rolling smoothly over the concrete. Upstairs, the panel remained slightly open, but no one asked why he had been there anymore. If this moment stayed with you, share what you noticed and follow for more stories like this. Thank you.